Hello and welcome to Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. What's the deal with Debunking Atheists, Volume 4? I have a couple of atheistic arguments I want to go over, and then I'll tell you how to get out of them. The first argument is the argument concerning Eric the God-eating magic penguin. Now, this argument goes that because Eric is God-eating by definition, he has no choice but to eat God. So, if God exists, God automatically ceases to exist as a result of being eaten by Eric. Unless you can prove that Eric, the God-eating magic penguin, doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. Even if you can prove that Eric doesn't exist, that same proof will also be applicable to God. There are only two possibilities. Either you can prove that Eric, the God-eating penguin, doesn't exist, or you can't. In both cases, it logically follows that God doesn't exist. So this is a cute little argument. However, the key to getting out of the Eric the God-eating penguin argument is to understand that God is uncaused. And because God is uncaused, there are various consequences to that. One of which is that God is not made of parts. This is what we call divine simplicity. Now, the destruction of something means the disassociation of its parts. So, because God does not have parts, God cannot be destroyed. And because God cannot be destroyed, God cannot be eaten. Eating something is to destroy it. Eric, the God-eating magic penguin, would have to destroy God in order to eat God. But God can't be destroyed, which means Eric can't eat God. Moreover, because God is not made of parts, but Eric is, because Eric at least has to have a mouth in order to eat. Eric can't eat God because you can only eat things that are made of parts. So Eric couldn't even hold God in order to put God in his mouth. So, the solution to this atheistic argument is that God is uncaused. God cannot be destroyed. God cannot be eaten. God cannot be put in something's mouth. So, there's that argument. All right, the second argument. The second argument says that because God is supposedly omniscient, meaning God knows everything, then how is it that God can understand human beings? Because human beings know less than everything. So, a human being is ignorant of a lot of knowledge. There's only so much information that one can fit in a finite brain cavity. So there is always things that human beings don't know. However, God by definition knows everything. So if God knows you as a human being, he knows your mind, then God would have to know what you know, which means God would have to know less than everything that is knowable. God would have to be ignorant in order to know your mind. But God can't be ignorant of anything because God knows everything. So you have a contradiction here. How is it that God can be both omniscient and also understand ignorance, the ignorance of a human mind, for instance? So this contradiction is an argument against the omniscience of God, which is really an argument against the existence of God. So, how do you get out of this one? Well, the key, again, is understanding that God is uncaused. Because God is uncaused, God's mind is also uncaused. However, a human mind is caused. Human beings are created beings. So a human mind is caused. Consequently, there's a big difference between the mind of God and a human mind. The mind of God, being uncaused, is mysterious. A human mind, being caused, is understandable to us because we understand our own minds. So, the mistake in this atheistic argument is to assume that God thinks like a human being and that God would have to become ignorant in order to understand a human being. But the fundamental assumption there is that God's mind is like that of a human being's. So in order for God's mind to equate with that of a human being, God would have to become ignorant, which is not possible because God is omniscient. But the fundamental assumption is that God thinks like a human being, that our minds behave similarly, that they're both temporal, that is, they both act in time, that they learn things, that things can be vacated from them and added to them. And that's simply not true. God's mind is uncaused, it's mysterious, it doesn't act in time, it is not a temporal thinking. It's not a temporal thinking mind. It is mysterious. It's incomprehensible. Human being cannot understand God's mind. It's impossible for a human being to understand God's mind. There's only one uncaused mind. It's God, and only God understands it. So it's like comparing apples and oranges. Comparing God's mind to a human mind is comparing apples and oranges. You can't. You're talking about something that's so different that you can't simply claim that God thinks like humans. He doesn't. So it is perfectly logical for God to understand uh, his creation, that is, human beings, and their minds, even though those minds don't contain all knowledge, because God doesn't think like human beings. God's mind isn't like that mind which he created. So to God, it's really just about understanding the creation which he made. It's not about understanding an uncaused mind. So that's how you get out of the argument. You'll find that a lot of atheistic arguments uh, can be defeated simply by understanding this one thing and the consequences that it has, and that is that God is uncaused. That's a very important thing to remember about God. Gets you out of a lot of atheistic arguments. Okay, so there's two more atheistic arguments and how you shoot them down. Uh, I hope you learned something. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And I'd ask you to subscribe. So take care.